Welcome to another edition of Coffee with the Candidates. I'm Nancy Winandy, representing Yankton Thrive, and with us today we have Jean Hunhoff, who is running as a state legislator for the Senate this year. Welcome.
Good morning.
Well, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself to the viewing audience?
Thank you, Nancy. Hi, my name is Jean Hunhoff, and I'm asking you to support my election to the South Dakota Senate. I want to work with and for you to continue to grow South Dakota to reach its greatest potential. I'm a native of Tabor, and with that, my values grew of faith, family, and community. I'm a South Dakota State graduate in the nursing program, and as a professional, I believe that continuing education was necessary in order for me to grow and to serve my people that I do. And so I obtained a master's in nursing and a master's in hospital administration. I've worked in many clinical areas. We came back to Yankton in the early 80s and were affiliated with Sacred Heart Hospital and ultimately with the Avera Health System. I worked again in clinical areas, and I also then became in administration both in hospital and home health and hospice nursing. I am married, and this summer will be 48 years to Dan Hunhoff. We have 4 children and 10 grandchildren. I'm a co-owner of Checkers Sports Bar in Yankton, and Dan and I also own Cardinal Fitness in Tabor to give back to our community there. We also own a small farm which is right outside the town of Tabor. I had the privilege of serving on the Yankton City Commission, and I was the first woman mayor of Yankton. I then went on to serve in the South Dakota legislature for 24 years, serving in both chambers with most of my years of service in appropriations, serving in leadership on that committee over the years. I am very much a sportswoman, love the outdoors, and very much keep focused on keeping my body physically, mentally, and spiritually positive. I love South Dakota and I love Yankton, and that's the reason I am running. I want to be able to work to keep our children and grandchildren in South Dakota so they can achieve their dreams and fulfill what they want in life.
Well, thank you for that. Can you share a little bit about what sets you apart from the other candidates?
I believe it's my experience and knowledge in the budget of the state of South Dakota. In reality, the only bill that would have to be passed by the state legislature is the appropriations bill. That bill is what funds South Dakota's departments, agencies, and provides services to our South Dakota citizens. I know the history of the spending and the expenses of South Dakota. I have always demonstrated accountabilities to the departments, asking for the resources and doing what is necessary for follow-up. I have established trust in asking for those resources and what is necessary. I have listened to my constituents and I follow up with them. And I am not afraid to challenge the ideas in a very civil manner. I worked all year on serving on all the committees and the constituents of this district. My background in healthcare has helped me and has benefited long-term care, healthcare that has helped to deliver legislation that has benefited disabled South Dakota citizens, rehab programming for drug and alcohol addictions, realigning nursing education in South Dakota so that the nurses that are being prepared to meet the needs of our South Dakota. The philosophy of today is that with the federal government's debt. And as you've seen over the last 2 years, certainly there's been a reluctance to accept federal dollars. The idea being that if we accept those federal dollars, we are then contributing to that debt. That is inaccurate because in reality, those dollars have already been allocated by Congress. And so if South Dakota does not accept those dollars, then those dollars go out to other states. They don't go back to supplement the debt. And what I'm saying is this: why should my federal tax dollars or yours go back to California, Arizona, New York? I realize that we have to be very cautious in the federal dollars we accept, but those federal dollars have gone to significant programming. And there's always the concern you're starting something new. I think the majority of the time we're supplementing what we have and we're growing some of our research that adds to our economic base in South Dakota. The other is that I think about is that we need to work on those dollars and use them and not be blindsided. Congress is the one that's giving us those dollars. That's where the decisions are being made. We as South Dakotans need how to use those dollars fiscally responsibly.
So share your views on the public education system. What is the state's role in funding and regulating public education, and how do charter schools fit or not fit into the educational options?
South Dakota Constitution says that we need to provide K through 12 public education. We've made strides in the past, especially with the Blue Ribbon Task Force in helping to retain teachers in South Dakota. But with the finances the way they are, we are falling behind. I have worked at that time to work on programming to assist with paraprofessionals, those that are working in schools, to get financial assistance so they could go on to school to become teachers and then became and retain in South Dakota. We need to find ways to continue to address the escalation of the costs and the sustainability of schools in South Dakota. We need to identify what are those financial resources that school needs. We also need to recognize that communities need to attract families. And in order for communities to attract families, they have to have a quality school system. If a young family comes along, you want them to live in those rural areas, you've got to provide that. So we need to keep that in mind in the decision making. The other thing is we need to support local control to give them the flexibility to allow them to chart their courses, not mandate what should be done. And we're finding that in the rural areas. They're being challenged, but they have their local school boards. They are from the community. They know what they need, and we need to allow them that flexibility and that what we need to support them. There need to be resources for teachers to balance their school day with the social, emotional, and physical needs of their children. You know, teachers are there to teach, but they're spending so much of their time on the other issues that are out there. We need to relook at that and how we can support them so we get back to the basics of teaching and we are dealing with these children in an effective manner that they can learn. As far as data for charter schools is not a new subject in South Dakota. Previously, most of those bills were brought by legislators from the reservations, and it was pitched as a way to operate schools that could provide for those children we know have challenges. But after doing much research, I've come to a different kind of conclusion. Charter schools have a conservative agenda, neither right nor wrong, but that's what their focus is on. And the data is indicating that on the charter schools, a couple of things are happening. Over the last 5 years, we have seen a decline in the number of students that are enrolled in charter schools. That's one issue. The other is the fiscal mismanagement that is coming. A charter school needs the permission of the local school district. If they don't get that permission to open a charter school, they can go to the Secretary of the Department of Education of South Dakota and make that request. If the request is granted, those students in that charter school then become eligible for the per student dollars that flow to all the public school systems. The challenge is that the school boards or the oversight committee of those charter schools can be anyone and anybody. They're appointed. They can do whatever they want. There are some things they have to follow, but they have no accountability that they need. The other portion is a lot of the charter schools across the nation contract with for-profit entities to operate their schools. And that's where the fiscal mismanagement comes into play. And as a result, they last about 5 years. Those companies have secured the dollars that they needed, they walk away, and then those students are left with no education, with no school, and they have to transfer to somewhere else. You know, the other issue that came about, as I said, when the reservations were for the challenging students. Ironically, across the nation, 58%, which is over half, only serve Caucasian students. So we're not dealing in the minorities or the other types of children that have challenging needs that they don't need to meet. So in a sense, they are cherry picking for the students that they want. I think the last thing is we always look at the states surrounding us, what they're doing, and where are we in the mindset. Right now, the neighboring states of Iowa, Minnesota, and Wyoming have charter schools. Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota do not. There is a reason for that. And again, primarily, we need to address K through 12 education and make sure that we have the best possible model out there, the greatest teachers, they're teaching our children, and the resources to help them.
So, in the previous legislative session, there were bills that approved changes to sales tax rates, giving voters the option to implement some localized options. What are your views on the current sales tax options?
I will be candid. Originally back, you can look at my voting record, I was not supportive of allowing local control for setting a tax base. And I thought about that for a long time, and I would discuss it with my colleagues. And the basis for the opposition for most of the people that were voting no in the legislature, you can't trust local government. They'll just go wild if they're able to do taxation. I have rethought that process over the past year after listening to the debate. I think local control has always been the key in South Dakota. These are people that we elect. These are our neighbors, and we're putting our trust with them. They're checking with the community, and the bill that is out there still requires the public input and the public vote on doing that. And I think that's the issue. If you're so concerned about it, then show up to vote. If you don't want it, or if you do want it, that's where you get the input. That's where you get the changes that are made. And I think we need to allow counties that flexibility to be able to do that.
There has been significant discussion around the future fund and incentives for economic growth. What are your views on current incentives and what modifications would you recommend moving forward to support growth in communities large and small across South Dakota?
You know, future funds are funded by businesses. I, as a business checkers, Cardinal Fitness, we pay in our taxes, we pay to that future fund. And I think that those businesses, small, large, should be able to benefit from those. I believe there was a bill this year that did some addressing of that, and the governor has come out in saying that there's going to be some changes. I think what stimulated this discussion was probably some inappropriate allocation of the funds for things that were not necessarily intended for. And that led to this discussion that's going on. But I believe that we have an economic board that again is appointed by the governor, but the intent is they're the oversight board. There is direction there as to what projects should be, and I think the governor and that board should be working closely together. It should not just be the governor deciding this is where it's going, but it needs also discussion and co-approval by both those bodies. And I think the other point is for the legislature to have the transparency, especially appropriations. And from experience, when GOED would come to do their budget, they would give us a listing of the projects for future fund, but it's been after the fact. There were metrics there that were to be met. We never found out about that. It would come at a later point in time. I think for the benefit of the legislature to have some kind of authority, at least oversight on those funds, there should be regular reporting and updates how those dollars are being utilized and what percentage and what those metrics that are being accomplished. And I think that if you did that on a regular basis, which appropriations does meet during the summer, you could do quarterly, just updates. It doesn't have to be detailed, but it goes back that the decisions that are made initially between the executive branch and the board of economic advisors for the GOED, that they really sit down and have that discussion and identify. It might also be a review of what the criteria should be. You always need to update because you have new businesses coming to South Dakota, new ideas, and we need to keep current with that status.
So, for clarification for the viewing audience, when we use the terminology GOED, that's the Governor's Office of Economic Development. It's something those of us in the industry take for granted that most people know, but those of you viewing might not know that acronym.
Thank you, because acronyms are very popular, and unfortunately, I'm bad with that, and especially when it comes to healthcare when I'm spewing out something. So thank you for reminding me.
So, what issues for Yankton County do you want to elevate to a statewide conversation?
You know, I think it would have to do with the mandates, and that certainly is a conversation piece that we have with the county, especially as to what those mandates are and how they impact. The second thing is we need to look at the kind of industry, businesses, small retail that we bring here to South Dakota, especially to Yankton. You know, Yankton, I'm going to say, is heavily into manufacturing, and that's where the funds have come into. And we need that if those businesses want to come into South Dakota. But we also need to be a part of that discussion, and we need to work with our local governments. We've got the city, we've got the county, and we need and the schools. They are all local because they all depend upon that. And I think a better working relationship to understand transparency and to have those pieces in place. That's what I'd like to see for our District 18. And of course, there's the ag sector too. Some things have been addressed, but there are other opportunities. But that involves really honest discussion, and that we get together, we collaborate, and we set that platform that we would like to have delivered to peer from this district.
So you mentioned appropriations earlier. Are there any areas within the state budget that you would like to see significant change?
Yes, there is. You know, one of the areas that I've always looked at in state government, we operate as silos. That means each department is an individual department. But the reality is those interdepartments, they interconnect. And I'm going to use a couple examples. Department of Social Services, they pay the Medicaid dollars. Department of Human Services for their elderly programs, they are the ones that sign up the people to be on those programs. Then you have the Department of Health with their prevention services that you provide out for the communities. They're all separate. I would like to see that there would be a collaboration in the budgetary process, that some of these programs departments come in either at the same time or have some of the same discussions, because we're dealing with those same things. And I get a little concerned sometimes because the funding is coming out of here, there's some other funding coming out of here, there's some other funding. And so if we could sort of redesign how those budgets are presented. And again, they're still separate budgets, but have the discussions together. And I'll use the example that worked with the nursing programs of South Dakota when I tried to realign so that we were all on the same page. We had 2 nursing programs in West River, we had multiple in East River, got the 2 largest universities to partner up, one to give up one program in West River and one would take it on, and in East River, they would, if the other, develop graduate programs and go further. And that worked out very well, and we've seen success of that. But it took a lot to bring people to sit down, and I think that's what we need to do when we're working with these other departments, trying to get them on the same page so we can follow the dollars. I'll use with TANF. With TANF, you have Medicaid payments, but you also have the Department of Labor, because they're the ones that are helping these people to find jobs. Again, we're isolating them. I'd like to see numbers together so we could really see a true picture of how they're working together, how they're expending their resources, and more importantly, that those people are being able to come up with programs and be independent in South Dakota.
So the lack of funding for counties has been a statewide topic, and you've also mentioned that a little bit here today. Do you have other ideas on how to support counties so they can continue to implement essential and mandated services?
You know, I think the basic thing is communication. It's really key as to what, and staying updated and getting that feedback from the county commission. You know, right now in Yankton County, ironically, roads are always number one. And so we continually need to work on that. And I'm going to say federal dollars are important for that. So if we send federal dollars back because we don't believe in it, we're not getting those federal dollars that we need to supplement. I think, you know, the other thing is probably not as pervasive, but the gas tax. You know, electric cars prior to this administration were very popular. And so if you have electric cars, you have further less dollars coming in from the gas tax. Well, that's sort of now sort of flipping, we're sort of going back, but at the same time, you need to have the gas tax. So you need to look at that. I'm not advocating increasing gas tax, but I'm just saying that is part of the equation if you're going to support that area. I think the other thing is services in the county, and of course EMS services has been a topic not only in this county, but certainly statewide, and I understand they're going to do further study this summer. How do we fund those? I know a bill was brought to create essential services. If you do that, then that becomes a mandate, and that is sort of skeptical for some people. But we've got to see if we can do more regionalization, and I think that's really how we need to look at county funding is, Can we regionalize? Nobody wants to give up anything. Everybody wants control. But at the end of the day, when you look at the population and the services, I think we have to be realistic. We need to have incentives that they want to, but at the end of the day, it becomes more cost effective and efficient for these counties to partner. I'll go back probably 20 years ago when a senator brought the idea of reducing the number of counties, and I saw another couple editorial pieces out there that we have too many counties because of the declining population. I'm not going to judge that, but what I'm going to say, there is some sense in that as to how you're aligning those services and county size. And we can look at the counties surrounding us and that population is declining. If you have less, then you have less of a tax base. Your property taxes go up because you don't have people there that are able to support it. They're no longer there. But if you do some regionalization, you can do some things. And I think you can have good quality, if not great quality, and certainly good working partnerships.
Some will say South Dakota is open for opportunity, and others say South Dakota is not a business friendly state. How do you view South Dakota? And please provide some examples that support your views.
South Dakota was open for business and doing well. However, businesses wanting to come to South Dakota are changing. And that's when it becomes a strife, what we had and what we didn't have. Again, historic in here, when we started the ethanol industry in South Dakota, they all got benefits from the state. We funded all startups for a period of time for our ethanol plants, and that was good. We knew what was coming. We have not had a big event of recent. If we look at the western part of the state, what's happening out there, if it wasn't for Sanford Underground and if it wasn't for Ellsworth Air Force Base, those are the two big projects that we have going on right now in South Dakota. On the east end of the state, we're sort of resetting what is needed out here. We've certainly seen the issue on property rights, and there have been legislation to certainly protect that, and I understand that. But I think that we have to look at what is the potential that is out there. And I'm looking for the ag sector to raise up some ideas that are there. This morning I was reading again, the economy for the ag sector with what's going on, and foreign countries not buying our meat products, our grain products, they're struggling. And how long can they continue to exist at that? And the bailout is not the answer from the federal government. And they're even saying that themselves. So I think we need to come to what needs to be that industry. And I think one place that we're overlooking is research. And I'm going to say South Dakota State University, not because it's my alma mater, but because that's where the ag research is going on. And if you look at the spinoffs that we have seen in South Dakota, my biggest one is the example of the dairy industry that has developed in Northeast South Dakota. That came because of a lot of the research that was done in South Dakota. Also with the production that is going on, with the crops, all that they're learning about that. Those are the kind of industries that are very profitable and would come to South Dakota. But we also have to recognize that we have to offer incentives. And that certainly is something that people are very wary of, especially if they say a large corporation coming into the state. But I think we have to look at what are the wins for us, what are the right incentives, but we've got to give communities that opportunity and the sectors that, again, number one, ag. What can we do? But they need to come to the table and explain to us and bring forth ideas so that we can work together in partnership.
What should South Dakota be doing to recruit people to move here so we have adequate workforce to support industry?
Well, first of all, I'm going to go back to what can we do to keep our children in South Dakota and our grandchildren. First of all, you need a basic, wonderful education, K through 12. We need to strengthen that and make sure that we have that available. Secondly, we need to continue to enhance our technical colleges and our universities for the programming that is needed in South Dakota. That Dakota Core Scholarship and all the others that we are able to provide and work in partnership have brought young people to South Dakota. And if you look at the technical colleges, their data shows that these kids are staying in South Dakota and they're staying in jobs, they're being paid well. So we need to continue to do that. The other thing is that we have to work with small and large businesses in South Dakota, especially small businesses. It's really challenging now. I'm going to take it from a personal standpoint. I have seen within the last 2 months that we don't have as many patrons. And I'm hearing that from other small retail businesses. They're not. The economy is certainly affecting people going out and spending dollars. And that's what retail needs. Small business needs those people to come. So we need to work with them to identify what are some opportunities out there? What do we need to help them with? Now, it's not necessarily more dollars. It could be other things that are out there that I'm not even thinking about. Maybe some incentives for startup, some of these other funds that are out there to do that. But you need that. The other thing is in your rural communities, if they're going to attract people, and I guess I don't want to be biased, but if I look at bedroom communities, those that are close to larger areas where they're probably the workforce that come into town, we need to help to support them. Even a convenience store or a gas station or a restaurant. And I know that's a risk, but we can work with other private sector people to help work with them, to stimulate them, to get them to see. I always look at the South Dakota Retailers magazine that comes out, and it puts the sales tax that comes out to communities. And I looked this past month, and ironically, the only small towns that they had listed, I believe, were Tabor, which is not in my district, but certainly my hometown. And I believe it was Gayville was the other one. But the other ones are so small, it doesn't. Now think about the communities. In Yankton, we depend upon our sales tax. That is a big portion of how we can do things in this city. Those small communities, when I look in Tabor, maybe a month they have $8,000 of sales tax. That's not a lot for them to do, but yet their workforce, their people that live there, they come here to Yankton. So again, it goes back to that regionalization. How can we partner with those larger communities to work with the smaller communities? Yes, you want those people. You have their workforce. You want to buy things here, but you also need them to exist. So I think there's a lot of dialogue and potential in working in that kind of concept.
So what are your thoughts on data centers?
Data centers are in the future, and we need to make sure that we can work together to protect our resources here in South Dakota and still be attractive to recruit to here. And it's not a black and white interest. We've got to find wins for both sides because that is the future. And again, we need to recognize that when you get the data centers, they expand the tax base. Again, reading the paper this morning, I'm seeing where Japan has cut a deal with the TVA in Kentucky and Tennessee, and they're infusing dollars to build small nuclear reactors there to provide energy. We talk about foreign investors, but yet Japan is seeing that as an opportunity to strengthen the United States because we are partners with them if anything should go amok in the world as we're experiencing today. In that kind of same thought process, we need to look at data centers that, again, that are meeting what South Dakotans need, but we need to be flexible and creative in finding those solutions. And we just can't shut the door and say they're bad. Now, this past session, they passed the Bill of Rights for landowners, and certainly a big concern is that as data centers come into South Dakota, they're not causing our rates to increase for the use of energy. And that's good. But at the same time, we need to be able to incentivize. That has to be the other side of the coin. If our rates aren't going up, we need to incentivize so that they do locate here in South Dakota. We cannot close our eyes to what's happening across the country. This is going to be a big factor. And until we see another big arena come out, and I think the other issue is when we're talking about AI, people are really worried about their jobs. You're already seeing jobs going away. And so you've got to look at if those companies are going to use artificial intelligence and data centers, I'm sure use some of that, but other industries, manufacturing or whatever, we're losing jobs here. So you need to work with those companies, not throw a black eye and say, no, we don't want it. Let's find where the win is. And I know we can do that, but you've got to have the right people at the table, the creative people, the research people that can work with all of us to ensure that our resources are safe, but we can open our doors and welcome data centers.
So do you have anything that you want to include in this interview today that was not a part of a previously asked question?
I do. If we look at our budget, and again, I'm really focused on that, we are seeing on an annual basis that we are doing special appropriations for programming in South Dakota that are escalating in need. And the one I'm going to talk about is domestic violence. We continue to see an uptick in that. We continue to see that the federal government is continuing to decline funding dollars for those programs, but yet those needs are out there. And every year, this group has come back to us and asked, and I believe this year they gave them $5 million. Now, $5 million may seem like a lot, but I believe we have between 25 and 30 domestic violence programs across the state. And if you look at their numbers, they're escalating. We're not addressing the cause of the domestic violence. We're dealing with what are the outcomes. We want to protect, we want to save those families so that they can continue on, not be harassed, not be threatened, and have a life for their children. Because that's part of the challenge too with the children. Those are the children that are having the negative experiences that are entering our school system that we need resources for. We need to look at some solid funding for some of these programs. And this is just an example that I'm giving that is continually showing up in the budget. You know, this year there was another budget for JAG, which is JAG. It's for juveniles and success in high school, middle school that they have, and then going on to college. Our JAG program in South Dakota has been very successful, and we've been using TANF dollars, and this year that was found, and that was not acceptable, but they did fund that program. So there are social programs that people are very reluctant about because they think that we continue to support those endeavors and go on and on. We're not addressing that need. We need to find some stability in some funding, and then we need to also look at how do we address the problem that's out there. As I said, taking care of these people is at the end. We need to catch in the beginning as to what we need to do. And more of those programs are surfacing, and we're going to have to continue to prioritize, but we need to be able to fix them, fill them in somewhere in the budget, and find dollars so that every year we see some successes, which we do see, but we also need to look at prevention. And I think that in other areas, that same thing, and I look at the Department of Health, you know, we're working with the some great things out there with for prevention, but we're going to have to look more again for people being accountable, teaching them responsibility, because that impacts healthcare. And again, I read too much, but insurance certainly is escalating in people, and I know that with Medicaid expansion, there's concern, but we've not hit the target that we've looked at, which is positive. So we're keeping these people healthy. Their cost of utilization is low. Again, we need to look at a much broader perspective, and we need to make sure that in helping people, we're getting them off the state system and getting them to be independent. But it's going to take a different kind of look than one-time funding for some of these programs.
Well, Jean Hunhoff, thank you for joining us here today. And sorry about the frog in my throat as I'm coughing during the later part of your interview. Want to remind the voters, Jean is running for the state senate in the election. Primary is June 2nd. You are running as a Republican on the ballot, and absentee voting starts April 17th. If you have any questions, you can find more of Jean's information on the Yankton Thrive website, yanktonsd.com. Thank you so much for joining us here today.